for taking things to the next steps. Our last speaker tonight is Jeremy Corbyn, Labour MP for Islington North, who's been a long-term supporter of human rights and civil liberties issues, not only in the UK but internationally.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me along here. First of all, to say thank you to Campacc for putting on this event and what has been achieved by Campacc, and to Garden Court Chambers for letting us have an event here tonight. We shouldn't take things for granted. Garden Court Chambers do a great job and give a lot of support to a lot of people, way beyond the basics of legal support. I think we should always acknowledge and recognise that. Without them, we would all be a lot worse off. Indeed, a lot of us probably wouldn't be here because of the work that they've done, so I think we should recognise that. And also these documents that have been produced, these four, are very, very useful, very interesting, very well written, and I think there's something that can be used to encourage people to understand things on a wider basis. Now, we have in this country a whole plethora of anti-terror laws. I'm going to say something about that in a moment, but there's also the question of the politics of liberation and the way in which the political norms in Britain have fundamentally changed in the past 25 years or so in respect of liberation struggles and attitudes towards struggles in other parts of the world. But first of all, on the Terrorism Act 2000, this thing came in before 9/11, and it was introduced and it was presented as being the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and that therefore this was a step forward. Well, actually, much as I'd spent years campaigning for repeal of the retention of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, I think I'd have stuck with the Prevention of Terrorism Act rather than the Terrorism Act 2000, because it's actually considerably worse in every conceivable way. The PTA was introduced in 1974 as a response to the Birmingham pub bombings, under which any person could be jailed without access to lawyers for a week and interrogated and so on. And on that basis, the Guildford Four were later arrested after the Guildford pub bombing, and during that week gave confessional evidence to the effect that they committed the offence, which they could not possibly have done. 18 years later, they won the case and they were finally released. But they spent 18 years of their lives in prison for something they didn't do, couldn't have done, because a confession was extracted from them. The Terrorism Act 2000 then built on that and worse, but whilst there were some legal safeguards in it in various places, basically it introduced the whole concept of banning organisations and the banning list that's been brought in. And I think that's one of the nubs of the problem. It also has within it the whole concept of the surveillance society under which we live, the use of evidence provided by the United States intelligence services, and unknown collections of evidence in this country, mainly by the police, in which Scotland Yard, as you probably well know, has dedicated officers dealing with virtually every community in London and indeed the whole country. There's sort of surveillance of them, what they do, who their political activists are, and what involvement they have in any particular political activity. And from that is built a whole plethora of information which is then used into the SIAC courts, the Special Immigration Appeal Courts, which are the most dubious form of legal process I've ever heard of, in that the SIAC court meets for the most part in private. Certain judges are allowed to be SIAC judges, certain ones are not. Certain barristers are allowed to be SIAC barristers, certain ones are not. They're not allowed to know the basis of the evidence against their client. They're not allowed to tell the client what basis they know the evidence to be of. And so these are secret courts, in effect, that I think are an anathema to any idea of a free society. I have always opposed terrorist legislation, not on the basis that I'm in favour of people letting off bombs in London or any other city of this country. I'm absolutely not. But that if somebody is committing a criminal act, then there is a criminal law and a jury system that can try them, hear the case and decide their guilt or innocence or otherwise. At least that is relatively in the open. by having the site courts, what we introduce is a whole element of secrecy and give incredible levels of power to the security services, who are largely unaccountable in what they do. And so I think the importance of having a campaign against the criminalising of communities is very, very important, and you've given 4 examples tonight. Now, Britain was an enormous colonial power and at various times controlled about a third of the Earth's surface, or at least thought it did. And Britain is a country that lives with the most incredible level of self-delusion of its own history and its role around the world, but also lives in a huge degree of double standards. And so I sort of grew up wondering why it was that when there was a colonial war going on in Kenya, which the British forces were involved in and treating the people in Kenya absolutely disgustingly, and the papers in Britain were running all this stuff about what an awful man Kenyatta was and Mau Mau and all the rest of it. The very same country was then giving political exile to people to come and live in London, escaping from a British colony. I always thought there was a kind of a degree of double standards here, which I'm still trying to work out. Answers on a postcard, please, in the new year on this one. But London has always been a very important place where there's been an opportunity for exiled politics to take place, where exiled communities have been able to represent themselves. And indeed, virtually every African leader in independence at some time lived in London. And indeed, the Great Pan-Africanist Congress of 1945 was held at Chawton-cum-Hardy Town Hall in Manchester, which eventually led to the independence of most of the British colonies in Africa. So there's been that tradition. Likewise, on the question of bans and unbanning of organisations, all through the apartheid years, even when the British government under Thatcher and various others was providing arms to South Africa, the ANC were able to operate in London and operate in a fairly open way in London, even though they were banned in South Africa, under the rules that now apply on what are deemed to be terrorist organisations. There's no question that the ANC would have been banned, the ANC would not be allowed to operate, and anyone active in the ANC would have been criminalised as a result of it. And so I think it's quite important to sort of put this thing into a historical context. Now, the points that are made in these documents are very good and very interesting. I've been involved in a lot of campaigns and lots of things, but take, for example, the question of the LTTE and the whole situation in Sri Lanka. You can trace the splits in Sri Lanka right back to the time of independence, the language riots of 1958 that came later, the big riots that came in 1983, the war that the country then descended into, and the decades of conflict since then and all the lives that were lost. And then eventually the making illegal of Tamil organisations in the West, thus choking off any opportunity for any kind of peace movement or discussion, and the supply of arms by the rest of the world to Sri Lanka, which ended up with the terrible disasters of last year. And whilst the Sri Lankan government is now claiming the war is over, for how long? Because if you keep on repressing people, if you keep on keeping people in detention centres, you refuse to allow the media to visit those detention centres, refuse to allow any political space or debate or discussion, then as sure as night follows day, at some point we'll return to all the horrors and disasters of the past few years. We've pointed this out on numerous occasions. But one important factor has been the massive organisation of the Tamil community in exile in London. And I thought the demonstration we held during the height of the conflict, when we had 200,000 people on the streets of London, was absolutely phenomenal. What was so disgusting was the British media almost totally ignored it. It was put down as a traffic jam caused by Tamils. You know, they committed a great sin. They held up London's traffic without at any stage sort of moving on to what the issue was actually about. So where do we go from here? Very quickly. The politics of it are very important. The politics of what's happening in each country are very important. But there are a number of principles here. One is the right of political organisation and to be able to say things. Secondly, in my view, we should be campaigning against secret courts and secret evidence and secret judges. That is fundamentally dangerous in any society. And thirdly, pointing out to the wider community in this country, this thing actually matters. Because I remember during the early 80s, some people said to me, why are you so concerned about the Prevention of Terrorism Act? I said, well, lots of reasons. One is I represent a constituency where there's large numbers of Irish people who have been affected by the Prevention of Terrorism Act. It was directed pretty well universally against the Irish community. Secondly, if you allow the Irish community to be treated in this way, this degree of interrogation, oh, thank you so much, thank you very much. You see, I don't like heating at home, and therefore I dislike heating here. The politics of it are that if you allow that to happen to the Irish community, allow it to happen to the Tamil community, the Baloch community, the Basque community, or any other community, then who's next? Because if you allow rights to be taken away and allow a special treatment of that community because they are terrorists, then where next? Mrs. Thatcher used to talk about the enemy within. We had an article today in The Guardian by Len McCluskey, very interesting article, saying that he thought there was going to be a whole period of industrial action against the cuts in social spending and all those other issues that are going on in Britain today. How long before somebody decides that these people are also a threat to our society, also a threat to our liberties? Anti-terror laws can be used against anybody at any time if you allow them to get away with it. And that's why against criminalising communities is very important, and we have to appeal to the widest possible movement to say if you want to live in a free society, it's something you have to fight for. If you want the right of self-expression, it's something you have to fight for. And it's exiled communities that they come for first, and then it's somebody else later on. Sorry to depress you all, but it's nearly Christmas, so you've got time to think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you very much to all of our speakers.